and the royal authorities who attempted to curtail these ancient rights. How right was C.S. Lewis to remark, "What we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men, with nature as its instrument." Those of us, I guess all of you here included, who value diversity of both peoples and nature, object to the inherent discrimination in such processes. So let's remember that the framework of human rights evolved explicitly to counter such policies. The horrors of the Holocaust were condemned and made forever illegal by the Genocide Convention, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and expressed the determination of newly forged United Nations to instill a more just social order. Alongside a perhaps more culturally bound Lockean, if you will, notion of individual rights emerging from the social contract, two core principles of international human rights law also took their place. First, the principle of non-discrimination, especially on grounds of race. And second, the right of all peoples to self-determination. This essential building block of international law can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia and also the American Declaration of Independence, to the notion that governments only have legitimacy with the consent of the government, a bedrock concept of democracy which of course has much deeper historical roots. It was only by invoking this principle that Woodrow Wilson was able to justify America's entry to the First World War, with the idea that the dismantlement of the German, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires should be accompanied by the liberation of the people and the forging of nation states, founded on this principle of self-determination. Actually, it's a term that Wilson borrowed from its originator, none other than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. It's a fascinating insight into the discriminating mindset of the global powers, to see just who and who did not have a seat around the table at the Treaty of Versailles. In the end, the League of Nations had surprisingly few members, and the colonial powers, who had won the war, that's England and France, remained unchallenged in their possessions, and even given mandates to rule further areas. So that war, in the name of liberation, had to be fought again. And yet again, it was justified as a fight for self-determination. The language was explicitly adopted by Churchill and Roosevelt in the Atlantic Alliance, that then saw fruition in the United Nations Charter and the United Nations Covenants on civil and political rights, and economic, social and cultural rights. But which peoples are to enjoy this right to self-determination? This time, a decolonisation committee was instituted to see to the dismantlement of empires. But when North American Indians from the American Indian movement appealed to the United Nations for recognition of their rights in 1977, the United Nations trembled. Yet, it instituted a process that after 30 years of deliberations finally resulted in a body of human rights laws that now recognises the collective rights of Indigenous peoples as peoples like any others to self-determination, to ownership and control of their customary lands, to self-government, and to the exercise of their customary laws. It's now recognised that no land should be taken from Indigenous peoples without their free, prior and informed consent, whether for mines or plantations or dams or colonisation schemes or for any other purpose. Moreover, the global project of conservation overseen by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the World Conservation Union, the World Parks Congress, agreed that protected areas must now respect Indigenous people's rights. And moreover, all lands in parks established without their consent should be returned to their ownership and control. And there are good reasons to welcome this. It is not only a matter of rights and justice, it is a matter of trusting Indigenous peoples to be better stewards of nature than we Westerners have been. As Ted Moses, former Grand Chief of the Council of the Crees, explains, when I think of self-determination, I think also of hunting, fishing, and trapping. I think of the land, of the water, the trees, and the animals. I think of the land we have lost. I think of all the land stolen from our people. I think of hunger and people destroying the land. I think of the dispossession of our peoples of their land. The end result is too often identical. We Indigenous peoples are being denied our own means of subsistence, or to the necessities of life itself. In particular, our right to self-determination contains the essentials of life, the resources of the earth, and the freedom to continue to develop and to interact as societies and peoples. What all this also implies is a complete reconceptualizing of the notion of property and identity, very different from our Western ways of being. As the anthropologist James Leach challenges us in his foreword to the very recent book, Ownership and Nurture, that I was reading on the flight here, he says, ownership and nurture. What if we begin here, rather than with the lock-in assumption of nature commonly given to be appropriated by human labour? Just for a moment, imagine that all that you are, your very flesh and blood, and all that you know, arise and have their origin in specific other people. Is that so far-fetched? This is the sense of being which so many Indigenous peoples have, but which we have perhaps lost. That we only exist as a communion with our kin and in our relations with nature itself. Interestingly, scientific studies now show that Indigenous peoples, when they regain control of their lands, so often make better stewards than any others. Even official state-protected areas in Amazonas are not so effective at curbing deforestation as Indigenous reserves. Communities given charge of their lands invest in their protection and the restoration of forests and woodlands. As my Dayak mentor, Kap Nazaris from Indonesian Borneo, once said to a community meeting that we organised together, in my community, our understanding is that we have rights to our land and the natural resources, both above and below the land. Everything up to the sky belongs to us. Several laws and policies have classified our forests as state forests, and the minerals as property of the state. We don't see it like that. I have hair on my arm, on my skin. Both are mine. I also own the flesh and bones beneath. They are also mine. No one has the right to take me apart. But the policy has cut these things apart, and thus has cut us into pieces. We want the land back, whole. It's not just protected areas that are best defended by the rights of Indigenous peoples. In Southeast Asia, where the world's forests are being swept aside to make way for oil palm plantations, the main resistance is coming from the Indigenous communities, who are saying no to the oil palm. Here's a picture of a diet community in a meeting with the World Bank, who were objecting to the World Bank's funding of the world's biggest palm oil company, Wilmar, taking over their lands. Working together, we got the World Bank to stop funding oil palm development for 2 whole years while they rethought their whole policy of engaging with the agribusiness sector. There are similar stories from all over the world, like that with the Tucani King in Brazil objecting to the establishment of eucalyptus pulp plantations on their lands. Despite police repression, they eventually got their lands back. Logging, mining, oil and gas exploration, all over the world, Indigenous peoples are demanding and gaining respect for their rights. Free, prior and informed consent, the right to say yes or no to what happens on their lands. This is now policy from many of the private sectors, at least private sector operators, at least the main brands that you see in the shops. It was the conceit of the Western world that if it is humans who are destroying the world, this world can only be saved by excluding people from it, by creating wildernesses of our own making, just as the kings of Persia and Europe carved their wildernesses out of the common people's lands. Wilderness, wild dior nest, places for undomesticated deer. And so the proponents of conservation created their national parks, void of people, emptying them of the very humans that have lived and looked after these same areas for generations, since time immemorial. Now, we realise that these are the very people with the knowledge and skills to best care for nature. It's taken us a long time. Thoreau, whose quote in Wildness is the preservation of the world, gave me the title for this talk.